You know, I talk sometimes about how great trucking was back in the day. It wasn't all sunshine though. There were some downsides to trucking back then, and I can list a few of them right off the top of my head. Probably the biggest one that comes to mind was that the trucks back then weren't nearly as comfortable as what they are now. Air ride came along later. Air conditioning wasn't part of the picture back then. Power steering. Most trucks didn't have power steering back then. The Jake brake even was an option for most guys back then in the 70s and 60s and 70s. And man, Jake brakes were an essential thing if you ran the mountains, but not all of us had them back then, and that was a big deal. The trucks weren't nearly as driver friendly. The transmissions, the old Spicer transmissions, boy, if you screwed up a shift on them, they could kick back and darn near break your wrist. And same with the Armstrong steering too, boy. It was unforgiving. So it wasn't all great trucking back in the day. Flat tires were a much more common thing back then. We ran tube tires. Those suckers went flat all the time. There was no tire service back then that you could just call out. So we changed all our own tires on the side of the road. It wasn't that big a deal. We carried the jacks and the wrenches, but you know, it cut into your day, and flat tires were a fairly common thing. The truck stops back then, there were more mom and pop truck stops, and generally the food was pretty good, but they were fewer and farther between. Some of them had showers and some of them didn't. So you could go a few days without having a shower until you found one of those little mom and pop truck stops that actually had showers they'd let you use. The trucks back then weren't nearly so well insulated in the cab area. So boy, on a cold winter's morning, you could just about freeze to death and really had to struggle sometimes to keep the windshield clear. Those old trucks could be quite cold. I remember one trip I did on Christmas Eve, and I basically wore a snowmobile suit in that old cab over just to keep warm. That's how cold those things were. And the other problem they had was on the hot days, the trucks overheated an awful lot, especially if you were in the hills pulling a lot of weight. It was quite common to have overheating problems back then, and all you could do was just limp it up the hill as far as you could go, then sit, wait for the thing to cool down for a while, and limp your way up some more until you finally got to the top. But the trucks overheated pretty easily back then. Back then too, I did a lot of reefer work, and the old reefer trailers weren't nearly as good as what they are now. The units weren't nearly as reliable, and they'd shut down and quit on you sometimes, and you had to figure out how to get them going again. And the boxes back then, they would hold the temperature for a couple hours when the reefer was down, but that was about it. The boxes these days can generally hold the temperature for 8 hours or so when the reefer unit is off. And one of the good things about back then was there were no tachographs at the reefer loads like there are now. So we used to shut them off at night so we could have a better sleep, because old units could be pretty damn noisy. On the bright side, there's a bright point right there. There were no tachographs. Nobody was really monitoring your progress back then or your load. As long as you showed up in one piece and the load looked good, things were fine. The fuel was a lot cheaper. The maintenance on the truck was a lot cheaper. The trucks themselves were a lot cheaper to buy. The exchange rate, if you're running Canada-US, was pretty much par, so you weren't losing money there. There were some serious advantages to trucking back then too, but like I say, I remember back in the early 80s getting caught in Nevada, and we weren't even running logbooks back then, and Nevada was just starting to enforce the logbooks, and you weren't really monitored at all. You were just left on your own, and they trusted you to show up when you were supposed to be there or as quick as you could get there. There was hardly ever any time stipulation. You just sort of do your best, get there when you can. There were no cell phones no way of tracking in, no GPS or anything like that, so they couldn't monitor you. So you were expected to call in once a day or once every couple days just to give them an update on your progress, talk to the broker or the receiver or whoever you needed to speak to and say, hey, I'm here, things are going good, I'm on my way, I expect to be in there Thursday morning or something like that. It was a lot more casual, and a lot of times you had a lot more time to get there safely. Stuff wasn't nearly as tightly scheduled as what it is now, and it gave you some breathing time. So if you came across something you wanted to see on the trip out or something like that, you could take a couple hours and look at it, or work on the truck. And often you had to work on the truck, often you had no choice. It needed something part way out, so you had time to swap out a fan belt or change tires or something like that. Whereas here, boy, you lose an hour these days with the scheduling and you're in trouble. We didn't have any of that back then. One of the best stories I remember was we were all anticipating air ride trailers, because boy, we thought that was going to be a big deal. So the company that I was pulling reefer for at the time, there was a fella, and I believe his name was Duncan, got the first air ride trailer in the fleet. We all owned our own trucks and trailers and everything. We just pulled for this outfit and they loaded us. But Duncan ended up with the first air ride trailer that we'd ever seen, and we were hauling a lot of hanging meat back then. So Duncan had loaded hanging meat out in western Alberta, and I remember catching up to him and following him through northern Ontario headed for Toronto. And because of this air ride trailer and the meat swinging back and forth inside, the whole trailer was rocking and rolling and leaning, and it was scary to watch. And I remember asking Duncan on the CB how he liked the air ride, and he could hardly hang on and talk on the CB at the same time, but you could tell he was worried. He wasn't able to make the time through the corners. He had to slow right down because the lean was so bad. He said the trailer rode much better as compared to the spring ride banging up and down, but boy, she sure did lean in the curves. But we made a better living back then. Everything cost less, and we just made better money. The rates were better, the fuel was lower. We just made better money, and it was just a better living, and I do miss that part of it. Better to me meant at the end of the day, or at the end of the week or month, I brought home some seriously good money. You had all sorts of money to buy a new truck every few years, and a new truck and trailer every few years. We were upper middle income class earners back then. We had all sorts of money for our own houses and new cars and stuff like that. Money was not a problem. We worked hard. We ran hard, make no mistake. But the difference between the gross and the net was significantly more back then, and incredibly a whole lot more than it is now. These days the margin is so tight. Myself, I don't feel that there's any money in it anymore. But back then we made seriously good money. And it was nice if you were away from home 10 or 12 days to come home with a paycheck for 12 grand or something like that for that trip. And that wasn't unusual at all. These days, that's just unheard of, So I do miss that. The trailers were a lot smaller then. Back then, I remember going from a 40-foot trailer to a 42-foot trailer. They were only 96 wide, not 102 inches wide the way they are now. And you could, with a long hood conventional, you could still easily get around town with them. They weren't nearly the high rises on their sides that they are today, where you couldn't get around half the corners in a town. They were a lot more maneuverable. And we managed to get more money on those 42-foot trailers than you can now on a 53-foot trailer. We did our own repairs. There were fewer scales. You could afford to fix the truck. You knew how to fix the truck back then because it was a pretty basic machine. It was a pretty basic piece of equipment. There wasn't any electronic technology that you had to master, and you didn't need a computer to repair it. Everybody back then relied on CBs for communication. We all had big radios. Some of them could talk for hundreds of miles. There were fewer mega carriers trying to steal the freight and cut the rates, which is not the way it is today anymore. And that's part of the reason the rates were so good, was there were very few mega carriers. There was a whole lot less regulation And drivers back then stopped and helped each other out. If one threw a fan belt or his fuel pump quit on him or something like that, you'd always see 3 or 4 guys cruise to the shoulder to give this guy a hand. We never left anybody stranded. There was a real camaraderie within the industry among the pros, and that was a really nice thing. They truly were gentlemen back then, more knights of the road types, and they would stop and help people in distress with their car broken down or whatever, or each other, as I say. And that was truly a better way of living, I thought, than the way it is today, where everyone's on a schedule and they just got to blow by because their electronic log's running out. They got 20 minutes to be there and they cannot afford to stop and help you, which is just, it's a sad state of affairs, in my opinion. And you know what else was different? When you bumped the dock back then, there was no delay. Everybody unloaded when they got to where they were going. There was none of this, well, we'll be out and see you in about 6 hours. There was none of that stuff back then. Everybody bumped the dock, the doors were open, the reefer got shut off, and you got unloaded, and it was as simple as that. Nobody wasted your time back there and expected you to hang around all day or maybe a couple of days just to get unloaded. In closing, I'd like to say that life for truckers back then was a whole lot simpler and a whole lot more enjoyable. So when you hear guys my age bitching about trucking the way it is today, it's because back then it was simply a better industry. We were respected as drivers, we were admired, we were treated as gentlemen and human beings, and we were well paid to do it. And all of that has been lost these days in the trucking industry, and I think it's a sad loss for society. Those days aren't coming back. We're going to have to adjust to the way it is now, and there are good things to look forward to too. So keep the rubber side down, take care, and I will see you on the back, all driver.